Joining us now to talk about the fight for Central Asia, Alexander Cooley. He is professor of political science at Barnard College at Columbia University, and he comes to us from New York City. Welcome to Toronto. It's good to have you here.
Thanks for having me, Steve. It's my pleasure.
We know a lot about Afghanistan. So when we talk Central Asia, everybody knows Afghanistan, but there are obviously a bunch of other stands that we know a lot less about. And I think it probably makes sense for us to start by just bringing a map up and we can go through them.
Sure thing.
To give people a better understanding of the neighborhood that we're talking. Beyond Afghanistan, Central Asia also includes all these former Soviet republics: Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan. We know a little something more about Kazakhstan here because we've had a couple of hockey players in the NHL from Kazakhstan. And of course, the neighbors, Russia and China, some pretty powerful neighbors as well. These borders are these borders today, but obviously have not been those borders for a long time, right?
No, that's right.
They move around.
They do move around, and Central Asia is one area that has been consistently conquered by great empires, by the Mongols, by the Ottomans, the Russian Empire, the British Empire, and most recently the Soviet Empire. And each one of these foreign powers left their own legacies, legacies of different types of institutions, dividing different ethnicities. And so the borders of Central Asia as a region have been fluid and quite contested. Sometimes they'd be quite political too. Give you an example. A few years ago, the United States State Department moved Central Asia from its Eurasia and Russia Bureau to its South and Central Asia Bureau.
What's the significance of that?
Significance of that was that it linked up to the desks in Afghanistan and Pakistan. And Beijing and Moscow saw this as a move that now Central Asia was going to be an object of U.S. interest and possible even U.S. hegemony, wanting to make the link between Afghanistan and the Central Asian republics. So borders aren't natural. Sometimes there really is politics to it. And it gets to a second point I would point out, that Central Asia has always been an arena of competition, a theater of competition, of great powers projecting themselves, wanting to use the region for their own strategic purposes.
You talked about ethnicities. How many different ethnicities are we talking about in this area?
Oh, there are dozens, if not hundreds. They're grouped in many different ways. Sometimes hard to fix on what exactly an ethnicity is, as opposed to just what's known as a clan or a tribe. But sometimes a lot of these groups are local and sublocal. So we have different layers of identity, ethnicity. We have the titular identities, right? What it is to be an Uzbek, for instance, or what it is to be a Turkmen or Kyrgyz. But then we have a very much regional kind of focus. Are you from the north of the country or the east of the country? What's your extended family? Who's your cousin? All of these layers of identity operate in parallel and are incredibly important for politics.
Have the ethnic makeup or the ethnic identities changed much since the demise of the Soviet Union a couple of decades ago?
The ethnic makeup is relatively similar. What we've seen is a real attempt at state building and nation building on the parts of elites. So similar to what we had in other processes of decolonization, say in Africa or Southeast Asia, we've seen national elites trying to forge a nation, trying to forge a state. Let's not forget that these republics, or these states, were rather republics at some point, meant to be in part of a Soviet whole, and they were integrated as such. They weren't designed to be independent states. There are lots of minorities within these countries. In a place like Kyrgyzstan, for instance, we've seen this ethnic violence between North and South. It's a result of having a very big Uzbek population in the South. So elites are faced with the challenge of building a nation, building a new national identity, what it is to be Kyrgyz or Turkmen or Kazakh, at the same time trying to assimilate and integrate these ethnic minorities within their state as part of the national project.
And if Russia and if China and if the United States are all interested in this area, it's got to be because there's lots of wealth there. What's the primary source of wealth?
Primary source of wealth is, of course, oil and gas. That is certainly a #1 focus for China. It's certainly a U.S. priority in a place like Kazakhstan. But Central Asia is also adjacent to places of interest, especially in the cases of China and the U.S. In the U.S., it's next to Afghanistan. And Afghanistan, as we know, is now this administration's #1 strategic priority. And so what Central Asia has become is in some ways a logistical hub for supporting operations in Afghanistan. So we have military bases in Kyrgyzstan. We used to have a military base in Uzbekistan until the government of Uzbekistan evicted the states. And now we've created all of these supply lines extending from Latvia up north or Georgia out to the west that traverse into Central Asia, that bring in the material and equipment that U.S. forces need in Afghanistan. So for the U.S., Central Asia is sort of the behind-the-scenes support area for what's going on.
Well, let's bring up a second map here, because there are, we've heard this expression many times, Central Asian pipelines.
Yes.
And if you check this map out, it's a bit of a, it's a bit of spaghetti, I guess is the best way to put it. There
That's
are
right.
red lines going all over the place.
Right.
How has the flow of those pipelines changed, again, since the fall of the Soviet Union? We see existing and proposed lines going into the future.
Right. Well, this is also interesting, contested, and very political. For the 1990s, we didn't have much in the way of new pipeline construction, not coming out of Central Asia. And what countries had to do at the time is rely on the old Soviet pipeline network, which was, of course, controlled and dominated by Russia. And in terms of natural gas, the giant Gazprom. So part of the contestation in the region was over pipeline politics. Which routes were going to be taken, because pipelines are fixed, right? Once these large investments of multi-billions of dollars are made, they have to be used. So for the longest time, we thought the competition was between Russia and the West over getting Central Asian gas out west and into European markets. And we had competing projects on the boards, South Stream, Nabucco, and so forth. And of course, Russia wanted to monopolize Central Asia gas to use it in its own network that it would sell to its European customers. But over the last few years, we've seen a new player enter the game, and that is China. And a lot of the gas that we thought was going to go west is now going east.
Who owns all the pipelines?
The pipelines are controlled by consortia that are...
So privately as opposed to government.
Well, these companies are controlled by or have ties to the government. So certainly in the Chinese case, these are Chinese state oil companies that have gone in with Central Asian state companies to build these. And the biggest one of these, and the most important one, is the one opened in December 2009 that goes from Turkmenistan up to Uzbekistan, up to Kazakhstan. It's called as the China Central Asia Gas Pipeline. This is projected in a couple of years' time to bring about 40 billion cubic meters of gas to China and join up the Chinese East-West pipeline that will take this gas over to eastern coastal cities such as Shanghai and the Hong Kong area. So it's of enormous importance to the Chinese. And to give you a sense of how much energy that is, current Chinese consumption of natural gas is about 80 billion cubic meters. So it'll be about half of current Chinese consumption that's going to flow from Central Asia.
That's a lot. Let's follow up with this then, a question about where geography, namely China, and ethnicity, namely the Uyghurs, meets.
Yeah.
And the question that comes out of this. So the westernmost region of China, of course, includes the Uyghur Muslim minority group, which has ethnic ties to Central Asia.
That's right.
How does the push for greater autonomy by the Uyghurs affect what the Chinese want to do in this area?
Yeah, it actually plays a great role in Chinese thinking and Chinese strategy. One of the things the Chinese have emphasized is trying to stabilize the region, stabilize the West, and conclude cooperative agreements with each of the Central Asian governments with an eye on stabilizing its West and controlling what they view as the Uyghur situation. So for instance, concluding border negotiations was extremely important to the Chinese. We had a legacy of Sino-Soviet disputes that they only managed really to clean up about 10 years ago in 2001. We also have increased security cooperation between Chinese security services and the security services of the Central Asian governments. And a lot of this has to do with monitoring cross-border flows of accused extremists, of transnational movements that Chinese argue have links to sort of international terrorist movements.
Exactly. I mean, presumably these would be pretty easy targets to hit, would they not?
Presumably. It's unclear how much of the sort of the Uyghur separatist phenomenon is driven by external factors versus internal factors. The Chinese like to play up that they have ties to Al-Qaeda, they have ties to Afghanistan, and so forth. Uyghur nationalists say, no, this is a domestic movement that is mobilizing to sort of talk about its grievances that it has against Beijing. So even that, the sort of the terms of contestation of what's driving this isn't clear. But you have seen the Central Asian governments under this regional security organization, termed the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, cooperate with the Chinese over cracking down on a lot of Uyghur movements that were actively operating in Central Asian countries.
Okay. Let me ask our director, Michael Smith, to bring that map up again. And the reason is, when it was the Soviet Union, obviously almost all of the red lines that we see there would have been in the Soviet Union. But now, the Soviet Union's broken up, and while much of it goes through Russia, it looks like much more of it doesn't. So how does Russia view its role in all of this now, given that so much of this action is not within its borders, per se?
Russia has to readjust. Russia has to readjust. It's not easy ceding what you once thought was your privileged sphere of interest. As President Medvedev called it, a zone of privileged interest. So Russia has had difficulty getting out of the type of post-imperial, post-colonial mindset. Russia, in some ways, wants some very intangible things. It wants prestige, it wants influence, it wants control, but sometimes it's more reactive than strategic. And in some way, well, it reacts to developments on the ground. So for instance, the United States puts a base in Kyrgyzstan and Manas. Now, of course, the base is being used for stability operations in Afghanistan. And no one, including Russia, wants to see Afghanistan collapse. The threat of extremism that would result. Plus, let's face it, tens of thousands of Russians die of narcotics overdoses every year. For them, it's a human security issue. At the same time, it's never sat very well, especially with members of the Russian General Staff, that the United States has military bases in former Soviet territory. Right. So there's almost this very conflicted notion about sort of the U.S. role. And that's part of the difficulty that Russia faces, that it's impossible to preserve the empire as it was. It needs to find a strategy for going forward, but the Central Asian countries want to have options. There are a lot of ties to Russia: linguistic, cultural, educational. A lot of these elites went to Soviet or Russian institutions. But these rulers want options. They don't want to be locked in to architectures, security or economic, that are dominated by Moscow. So China, and the US to a lesser extent, but certainly China, offers them alternatives.
I wanted to follow up on that because just by virtue of where they are in the neighborhood, you would think that Russia and China have huge advantages over the United States in terms of controlling the future. The Americans obviously have interest there as well. What's their play here?
Well, the play is short term, and this is something that's of real concern, I think, to some of the Central Asian governments who are viewing Afghanistan as an increasing security threat. You know, it took a while for the Central Asian governments to actually appreciate what was going on in Afghanistan was affecting them. For some, this was a way to sort of be in the headlines. For others, it's a way to have military bases, perhaps to make money off base-related things like fuel contracts and so forth. But now I think they are realizing the potential for spillover if Afghanistan is not stabilized, especially as the northern part of Afghanistan has become more and more volatile. At the same time, President Obama has announced that he wants to draw it down. So this is giving sort of a timeline, the horizon, in which if the United States is not in Afghanistan or is there in lesser capacity, it's probably not going to be around and engage in Central Asia either, which leaves the region to Russia and China.
Talk to us just finally about human rights and how that plays in the area, because I think it's fair to say the United States foreign policy includes a lot more interest around human rights than does China's or even Russia's. How does that play in the mix here?
This has been one of the most difficult tasks confronting U.S. policymakers. As you said, for Russia and China, human rights is a non-issue in that they don't have to bring it up in meetings. And in fact, they can pat these regimes on the back and say, we support political stability, you're right to sort of rule the way you do, and we're not going to interfere in your internal affairs. Very much the same thing that China says when dealing with African countries, for instance, when it's after natural resources, that you're your own sovereign masters, and we respect that. For the U.S., it's been a lot more tortured. The U.S. Thinks of itself still as kind of having a values agenda, and so supporting certain human rights, having NGOs, pro-democracy organizations, sending election monitors, all of these things were part of engaging with the Central Asian countries. But over the last few years, Central Asian governments have become savvy and starting to say, look, United States, we have things you want. We have access to military bases, we have oil. Why don't you stop lecturing us on these human rights things? You know, these election monitors, thanks but no thanks, we don't need them.
How's that pitch working?
It depends on which agency you talk to. And so here we see real schisms within the United States government, or how to proceed. Of course, there are the same tensions that exist elsewhere between the State Department and the Pentagon. The Pentagon, it's focused on Afghanistan. and it's focused on supplying those troops to Afghanistan. So anything it needs to do to get the buy-in, the cooperation of the Central Asian governments, including contracting, providing economic incentives to logistics companies controlled by the ruling families, it's willing to do. General Petraeus has been very clear about this. State Department is more concerned about the human rights situation, about the democracy situation. One of the things that just happened in Kyrgyzstan with the collapse of the government there is that the Kyrgyz opposition said, United States, you stopped meeting with opposition figures and you just placated this dictator, Kurmanbek Bakiev, because he was holding you over a barrel and threatening to kick you out of the base. You know, you didn't stand up for your values. And now there's a lot of public anger in Kyrgyzstan towards the United States, saying, no, the United States acted no differently than any of the other great powers operating in the region.
Fascinating. A much misunderstood part of the world, but a little less so, thanks to your visit here today. Thanks so much, Alexander.
My pleasure, Steve.